Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first lesson in this course of 9, which is titled The Byzantine Empire. And somebody's already asked, why is this term considered somewhat controversial? Why is it that I may need to use the term Byzantine Empire in inverted commas? And the answer is that during the past 20 or 30 years, some people have done their best to make this into a deprecated term. It is somehow insulting to the Greek people as they are now, and it is also somewhat demeaning to these people in the Middle Ages to call them Byzantines, because this is seen as a term of Western abuse. A much better title, we are told, is to call this the Medieval Roman Empire, or perhaps the Eastern Roman Empire. But there are certain groups on Facebook, for example, which will not allow people to use the B word. You must not refer to anything as the Byzantine Empire, a Byzantine emperor, Byzantine art. No, it must be Medieval Roman or Eastern Roman. I regard this as stupid. The Byzantine Empire is what we have called this state organisation for a number of centuries. There is nothing necessarily pejorative in the name. Whether or not it is strictly accurate is not enormously important. The people who have the greatest right to be offended by being called Byzantine have been dead for a long time. For those people now alive who choose to be offended if someone refers to this as the Byzantine Empire, I feel their pain, but am not inclined to lessen it. If you want to call this the Medieval Roman Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, that may be a more accurate way of classifying this, because this very long-lived and very remarkable entity is what joins the ancient and the modern worlds. It is something which existed and which at all times in its existence traced back its origins, not to the foundation of the city by Constantine, but to the foundation of Rome by Romulus himself in 753 BC. At no point did anybody connected with this empire believe that there had been a fundamental break and that something new had been established. That being said, here is the Roman Empire at its height. It is a very large and a very impressive state system. If you leave aside the suffering and bloodshed that attended its conquest and the doubtless immense injustices that attended its maintenance, if you simply look at the extent of territory and the extent of time during which those territories were held, you can say that this is not only the last but the greatest of the ancient empires, and it is one of the most remarkable empires of which we have any understanding. It is, of course, the empire that has actively or passively shaped the world in which we live, and which is floating somewhere in the background of all our assumptions and expectations about the world. Those who lived in it, with the possible exception of the Jews, who were frequently sceptical about it, regarded, for the most part, as divinely ordained by the gods or by God or by the fates, and that it would, in one way or another, last for ever and ever and ever. Of course, it didn't last for ever and ever and ever, but people did believe that it would. Here is a representational list of the first 18 of the Roman emperors, running from Julius Caesar, whom we can take as the first of the emperors, I won't argue about that, all the way through to Commodus, These are the first 18 supreme masters of the Roman world after the end of the Roman Republic. Whether these were inspired geniuses, and I think you can call Augustus that, whether they were barking mad, which probably applies to Caligula, whether they were showmen or tyrants or both like Nero, whether they were a safe pair of hands like Tiberius or perhaps Nerva. It doesn't matter who they were. These were the first 18 emperors, and these were the men who fused the entire Mediterranean world into a single state system dominated by a bureaucratic military system which centred on the emperor. And these men were all judged by how well they directed this machine to protect the core territories of the Mediterranean world, and they were judged by the secondary consideration of how well and to what extent they spread Greek and Roman civilization. But although at its zenith there were people who believed that the empire would last forever, it didn't. Starting around 1400, the Italians pioneered the idea of a decline and fall. They tried to explain this decline and fall in terms of the vices of the emperors and the vices of their subjects. The barbarian invasions, these were the natural consequences of the internal moral decay of the emperors and the subjects of the emperors. Whatever the case, you look at these dates in Roman history. 378, the Goths crossed the Danube. 406, a confederation of barbarians crossed the allegedly frozen Rhine. 410 AD, the sack of Rome. 476, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed by a barbarian chief. And that is the end of the Roman Empire. The Middle Ages have begun. That is now the history of our own countries. From the Renaissance onwards, in Western Europe, the idea has become effectively set in concrete that the Roman Empire is established, it exists, it declines, it falls, and it's then followed by these medieval kingdoms, the Kingdom of the Franks, the Kingdom of the Ostrogoths, the Anglo-Saxon settlements in England, and these are the origins of our own world, and you can forget about the Romans. Except that, have a look at that pink area, which is ringed about in red. What is this? Now, this is an empire. Its capital is in Constantinople. It rules the territories of what had been the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. Its ruler calls himself an emperor and is called an emperor by his subjects. The subjects of the emperor call themselves Romans, and they are there until 1453. Oh, there are changes in borders before 1453. But this area fringed in red is for much of the 1,000 years before 1453 the largest and richest and most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, and it regards itself as the Roman Empire. If you accept the existence of this entity, then what happens to this whole idea of a decline and fall? This question was addressed in Western Europe at various times from the Italian Renaissance onwards, and the considered response is in William Lecky's great History of European Morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, which is a work of great genius. It is a work that I wholeheartedly recommend, even though it does contain a number of statements which are perhaps exaggerated. And what Lecky says of the Byzantine Empire is, of that Byzantine Empire, the universal verdict of history is that it constitutes, without a single exception, the most thoroughly base and despicable form that civilization has yet assumed. There has been no other enduring civilization so absolutely destitute of all forms and elements of greatness, and none to which the epithet mean may be so emphatically applied. The history of the empire is a monotonous story of the intrigues of priests, eunuchs, and women, of poisonings, of conspiracies, of uniform ingratitude. That is the considered opinion of an entire strain of Western scholarship expressed in 1869. Have a look at this moving GIF. You can see that after 1400 the empire becomes a shadow of itself and there is no recovery. But you'll notice that in the 1,000 years before then, there are times when the empire shrinks and shrinks alarmingly, but there's always a recovery afterwards. All through the Middle Ages, in the Eastern Mediterranean, this empire is continually shrinking and continually growing and continually existing without any doubt, and must be continually taken into account by all the other powers in the region. And this cannot be seen as a civilization so destitute of greatness that it was always tottering on the edge of dissolution. It is one of the most remarkable empires that has ever existed, one of the most remarkable states that has ever existed in the Mediterranean world. It does develop without any substantial break from the high Roman Empire of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. There is an entire industry of representations of the degeneracy of the Romans after a certain time in their history, and this is The Roses of Heliogabalus by Lawrence Alma Tadema, a very fine artist, and I like to show his pictures, shown in 1888. This is the Emperor Heliogabalus. He was the emperor in the 230s AD, a most unusual young man. There is a little bust of him on the right. He is somebody who had a number of wives. One of them was the chief Vestal Virgin. He also had a number of husbands, and he sent his agents combing through the empire, always looking for new husbands for himself. I won't go into the frequently disreputable details of it, but he always made sure that when his agents were sent out looking for fresh husbands, they were well equipped with rulers. He was one of the strangest of all the Roman emperors, and he is seized on by many historians, or has been seized on by many historians, to show, look, this is the utter degeneracy into which the Roman Empire fell, certainly from the time of Commodus, and perhaps it was tending towards that for some time before. How on earth could an empire survive when it is ruled by such worthless degenerates as Heliogabalus? And then make a list out of others. You can add Commodus or Nero or various other people. The truth is that it doesn't matter what the emperor is doing in Rome for the most part. What matters is the health of the overall bureaucratic and military machine, whether it is fed with enough tax money and whether it's fed with enough manpower to keep it going. After about 150 AD, a series of climatic changes in the Mediterranean world, and perhaps in the world at large, meant that the bureaucratic and military machine that was the empire just didn't get sufficient men and money to keep it efficiently in operation. And it may be that the poisonings, the stabbings, the actions of the Praetorian Guard in Rome that all of the deeply unpleasant things going on in the imperial city were not causes of the difficulties into which the empire fell. They were symptoms. They were, at the worst, effects. Rather more important than how many husbands the emperor had is this. This is a much better indication of what went on after about 150 AD. Inflation is always a sign of a state under pressure. It has more spending commitments than it can meet. Nowadays, you don't even use the printing press. Clever things are done with computers, and additional deposit money is made out of thin air. But in the pre-modern period, when money was gold and silver coins, it was normal for a government to find itself with more commitments than it was able to meet, to grab all of the silver coins as they came in from the taxpayers. The money washes into the treasury in tax payments. You take 100 silver coins, you mix them with a certain amount of copper, and you remint them. 100 silver coins come in, they're melted down, mixed with 20% weight in copper. 120 silver coins go out. You expect these to pass at face value, and so you have increased the purchasing power of your government by 20%. And as long as you don't do it by as much as 20%, and certainly not 20% in one go, you can get away with it. You can get away with a declining standard over many years. It will take a while before people notice that the coins contain less silver than they did, but after a certain point, people wake up to what's going on, and then people begin to weigh the coins. They start testing them for their silver content, and eventually the coins pass by weight. Looking at the Roman coinage between about 150 AD and maybe 300 AD, what you see is a steady debasement, which shows a government under pressure. And that is what happens in the 3rd century onwards. This is not a straight line decline and fall. What happens is that at the end of the 3rd century, when it looks as though the empire is on the verge of breaking up, rival emperors all over the place, parts of the east grabbed by a Syrian husband and wife, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, for example, when it looks as though the empire is on the edge of complete dissolution, there is a sudden turn up for the best. You have a series of emperors, all from the Balkan provinces, all from the territories of what used to be Yugoslavia. Here is a list of them. The Emperor Decius, who ruled from 249 to 51, all the way down to Diocletian, who abdicated in 305. So you have a 50-year period of these Illyrian, or these Balkan emperors. And these were men who, a little bit at a time, or sometimes in the case of Aurelian and Diocletian, a lot all of a sudden, but these are men who during that 50-year period first of all stopped the empire from disintegrating, and then restored it to a semblance of greatness. They stabilized the empire. It was not simply a matter of military victories, fighting off the barbarians who had poured across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, or fighting off the Persians who had recovered themselves in the east and were now sniffing around places like Syria. It was also a matter of refounding the empire, re-establishing it. And the greatest of all of these Illyrian emperors, the greatest of all the men who at the end of the 3rd century identified and solved most of the problems faced by the empire, was Diocletian. And there's a bust of him on the right, 284 to 305, 21 years as emperor. That's longer than anyone since, let me think, 41. Yes, that's the longest in several centuries. Now, the problems that were faced by the empire, it had been put together with no overall plan. There was no single scheme of government for the whole empire. Every province was governed in a different way. There was a very weak central government. It was difficult for the central government to get its way. There was very poor financial management. The taxes came in, they were spent on various projects, and the imperial government itself often had no control over where the taxes went when they came in or how they were spent. You have a vast diversity of nationalities under the veneer of a Greek and Roman civilization. When it had been established by Augustus, the empire was a military dictatorship under the cover of a free constitution. That can be taken as a work of genius because it gave monarchy to a world in which the most important people regarded monarchy with horror and disgust. Augustus was able to rule as a monarch by not presenting himself as a monarch. That had been 300 years before, and since then there had been a fundamental change in the Roman world. Nobody seriously expected the empire to function as a constitutional republic. The idea of the emperor as simply another citizen who was invested with unusual powers for the duration had worn very thin. It was now causing serious harm to the stability of the empire, because if the emperor is just an ordinary man invested with unusual powers for a certain time, it means that anyone can be an emperor, anyone at all. If you don't like the emperor who is in Rome, you simply get yourself put up as an emperor by your soldiers, let's say. If you can win a battle in a civil war, then you become the emperor. All of these problems and others were identified by Diocletian and his advisors, and they brought about a revolution in the structure of the empire and the way in which its government was viewed by its people. The emperor declared himself a divine right autocrat. He took off his toga and put on a purple silk robe. He put on a diadem. There was no more walking around the Forum in Rome, shaking people by the hand, clapping people on the back, and pretending to be an ordinary senator. The emperor now disappeared behind an army of eunuchs, and when he did show himself in public, everyone was expected to do a full prostration before him. Down on the ground, bang your head 3 times on a carpet, because you are in the presence of your divine Lord and Master, which was viewed by Gibbon as something of a come-down from the old idea of the Roman Principate. But at the same time, once the emperor becomes a divinely ordained being who cannot be approached by ordinary mortals, the number of military coups, of assassinations, of civil wars drops away very significantly. The greatest source of political instability during the 3rd century is brought to an end at the end of that century by Diocletian, who says, "I am not an ordinary man who just happens to be the emperor. I am the living embodiment of the gods, and you must treat me as such." And as I said, this is politically useful. It means that other people are not prevented from making themselves emperor, but it becomes a great deal harder. If I wanted to push the Queen aside and make myself King of England, can I do it? And the answer is no, of course I can't, because the Queen is the Queen. I'm not a member of the royal family. I have absolutely no legitimacy. It doesn't matter if I get hold of the entire royal family and machine gun them to death and throw them down a coal mine or something. There is absolutely nothing on earth that I can do to make myself King of England. And because of that, nobody tries to do it. Because it can't be done, nobody tries to do it, which is possibly one of the secrets of our political stability over so many centuries. And Diocletian tried to do something like this with power in the Roman Empire, and he did not entirely fail. It was not a complete success, but it was not a failure either. Diocletian also realized that the empire, as it had come down from the 1st and 2nd centuries, was now too large and too diverse for any one man to rule. There were too many critical threats. There was the Rhine frontier, the Danube frontier, the Euphrates frontier. The empire needed to be divided, not into separate empires, but it needed to be divided into semi-autonomous zones, each ruled over by its own strong man who would give full attention to his own critical frontier. Diocletian settled all the external threats to the empire. He also reformed the empire fundamentally, and at the end of 21 years, he became the first emperor ever to abdicate. He laid down his power as emperor, went off to Spalato, or Split, I believe it's called, and spent the rest of his life growing cabbages. And so this is the new shape of the Roman Empire. You have the East, which has its working capital in Nicomedia, and then you have 3 other areas. There are 2 Augustuses, one in Rome, one in Nicomedia, and under each Augustus there is a Caesar who looks after some other part. It seems to work rather well, and it does work well. Although after Diocletian retired as emperor, there was a decade of occasional but undeniably renewed civil war. Eventually this man, Constantine, comes out on top. By 312, Constantine is the sole power in the Mediterranean world. He also is a great creative genius when it comes to maintaining power is concerned. He kept all of the changes brought in by Diocletian, but he made 2 further very important changes. The first is that he established Christianity as the official faith of the empire, and the second is that he founded Constantinople as the new Rome. If you are a devout believer, there is no need for secondary explanations. This is the true faith, and it was part of the divine plan from the very beginning that the empire would turn to Christianity, that the empire would establish Christianity as its faith, and everything else is so many facts along the way. However, if you look to these secondary causes, if you ask, how was it that the followers of a crucified Jewish carpenter eventually managed to take over the whole of the Roman Empire, you can make up a list of bullet points which are worth discussing. I think the first important step is that after the crucifixion, St. Paul turned up, and he purged the new faith of anything that was specifically Jewish. Although Paul himself was Jewish, he was Saul of Tarsus, a rather important man in the Jewish ruling class. Paul had the very clever idea not of staying in Jerusalem to argue it out with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. His idea was to take the faith on a great recruiting tour of Asia Minor and the Greek East. Not to address himself to the Jewish communities, well, not necessarily to the Jewish communities in the cities of the Greek East, but instead to take the new faith to the Gentiles. And at the end of 20 years, Paul went back to Jerusalem, at the head of an immensely expanded early church. By the end of the first century, although there were still Jewish Christians, there were still Jews who regarded themselves as Jewish followers of Jesus Christ, the great majority of Christians were Greeks. They were Gentiles. The new faith was transplanted. It began as a Jewish heresy. Within a few generations, it had become a new religion for the Greeks. And it is a very remarkable religion for the Greeks. There are many other mystery religions which have been accepted into the Greek East, taken from various subject nationalities. The cult of Isis, for example, borrowed from the Egyptians. The cult of Mithras, borrowed, I think, from the peoples of Mesopotamia. There was the cult of Cybele, a Phrygian goddess whose priests were supposed to castrate themselves. There were any number of these Oriental mystery religions going the rounds. Christianity came out on top. Christianity was almost from the first in a class of its own. It attracted writers and organisers of genius. Within a few generations of St. Paul's tour of the Eastern Empire, there was a Christian church which was established throughout the whole of the empire, a shadow organisation of bishops and districts. Every province had its church hierarchy. Every substantial city had its bishop. And these bishops and these communities saw themselves as the local branches of a universal single church. And within this universal single church, you have writers and philosophers of great genius, vastly superior to anything that the pagans in this age could offer themselves. You have men like Tertullian, men like Origen. You have the beginnings of an entire counterculture, a shadow government for the empire and a shadow intelligentsia, both of which turned out to be superior to the official institutions. And although for several hundred years to be a Christian was to be a traitor, although there were a series of persecutions in which many Christians suffered a painful death, none of these persecutions had any effect on the growth of the church. The only effect they seem to have had on the church was to purge it of fair weather friends and to keep its enthusiasm alive. Christianity grew and grew. Its intellectuals synthesized the thought of Aristotle and Plato with the Jewish idea of history as a story with a single direction and an overall purpose. You have a literary movement which is not in competition with pagan literary movements. It simply flattens these other movements by the range and the quality of its output. You have close bonds of unity and mutual help. And what this means can be this. You are in a city somewhere in northern Greece, and one day the Goths turn up. They've broken across the Danube. They don't kill you. What they do is they take you and your loved ones prisoner, and you find yourself after a few weeks sitting in a vast slave market outside the bounds of the empire. The question is, who will buy you? And then suddenly from nowhere the priests turn up, wandering around with great bags of silver, asking, "Are you a Christian, my son?" And you say, "Yes, I am a Christian." And they ask you certain questions. What was the name of Christ's mother? Who was her husband? asking certain rather basic questions, which allow them to say, "Yes, my son, I accept that you are a member of the faith." "No, I'm afraid you are not a member of the faith because you do not know these basic things. And if you are a Christian, silver changes hands and you and your family are set at liberty." And that example, repeated a few times, certainly brings in new recruits. You also have inspired leadership. Christianity spreads in all directions. And as I said, there are other religious movements in the empire. As mentioned, the cults of Isis and Mithras, etc. But nothing is able to compete with Christianity. Nothing has that mixture of solid government that spans the entire empire and keeps all of the various local churches stitched into a single universal structure, embracing the empire and often stretching beyond the boundaries of the empire. Nothing else is able to match the growing literary and philosophical brilliance of the church, and nothing else is able to grow as Christianity did. We don't have anything approaching statistics. You will occasionally read in history books that by about 300, 10% of the city populations in the empire were Christian. We have absolutely no grounds for saying any such thing. All we can say is that in every city in the east and in many cities in the west, the church was an established presence, and although it had been illegal for several centuries now, it had also existed for several centuries, and most of the time, when not persecuted, it was an accepted and indeed a respectable part of daily life, and that the Christians formed a significant fraction of the various communities in the Greek cities of the east and increasingly in the cities of the west. The reason Christianity was illegal in principle and sometimes in practice was that an attempt to impose a common loyalty on the various peoples of the empire had led to the cult of the emperor. Nobody was expected seriously to believe that the emperor himself was a god, but to throw a few grains of incense on the altar and to regard the empire in public as a god was one of the attempted bonds of unity that was set up within the empire, and Christians refused under any circumstances to sacrifice to the emperor because it was blasphemy. The Jews also refused to sacrifice, but they were an ancient and established people, and they were given a dispensation. The Christians were not an ancient and established people. Theirs was a religion of slaves and common people and general renegades. These were troublemakers. If they refused to sacrifice, they would sometimes be persecuted. But as I said, the attempts at persecution had all been fruitless. The church grew and it continued to grow. It didn't matter how often or with what enthusiasm it was persecuted, the church grew. Until eventually, and this may have been a matter of luck, it seems that Constantine's mother, Helena, was a Christian, and his father, Constantius, he also was sympathetic, and Constantine's father, Constantius, was one of the Caesars, one of the junior emperors appointed by Diocletian. When Constantine came out on top in the struggles that followed the abdication of Diocletian, it was perhaps only natural that Constantine should repeal all of the persecutory laws against the Christians. Indeed, the Edict of Milan declared universal religious toleration. It didn't matter what religion you followed, you would be left in complete peace by the imperial government. There is a story that during one of the crucial battles of the Civil War, when Constantine turned up outside Rome with an army, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he was given a vision from heaven. A crucifix appeared in the sky with the words around it, "By this sign conquer." And because Constantine did win that battle, fair's fair, he established Christianity as the faith of the empire. That is a story. There may be some truth. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that for a long time the emperors had been looking for some basis of a common loyalty within the empire. We mustn't think of the Roman Empire as divided into two zones. In the east, everyone spoke Greek. In the west, everyone spoke Latin. No, there was an immense diversity. The official languages were Greek and Latin, and everyone who was important spoke and particularly wrote Greek and Latin. But beneath that very thin veneer, you have an endless diversity of peoples and languages. Constantine's idea was that Christianity would be the glue that would hold the empire together. Everyone would become a Christian, and everyone would listen to the church when it preached boundless obedience to Constantine, not simply as the emperor, but as the 13th apostle of God. Constantine began by repealing the anti-Christian laws. He declared a total religious toleration, but within that total religious toleration there was a continuous bias towards Christians. Two young men present themselves for a job in the administration. They are both equally well qualified, they are both equally intelligent. One of them is a Christian, the other one isn't. The Christian gets the job. And you can imagine what effect that will have over several generations. Since paganism was hardly ever exclusive, and since it does appear that many pagans did not hold fixed views, they didn't worship their gods with the same absolute commitment as Christians, you can see that in that kind of competition where Christians have the preference, the number of Christians will grow and grow and grow. There were substantial numbers of people who refused to convert. Right until the first quarter of the 5th century, the extreme upper class in Rome hung on to its pagan faith and traditions, and in the countryside the people were almost untouched by the missionaries, and it was up to churches in the 5th and 6th centuries to do their work in the countryside. But by about 400, if you take the cities as the empire, then it is possible to speak of the Roman Empire now as the Christian Empire. Let's now turn to the possibility of a new capital. Have a look at Rome. Rome occupies a nice central position within the Mediterranean area, or it seems to occupy a nice central position, but it is about 100 miles from the sea. You have to get down the Tiber, or you have to get down a canal before you get to Ostia, the port. It's facing into the western Mediterranean. It doesn't face east to the most populous and the wealthiest districts of the empire. It's also a long way from all of the important frontiers. To get messengers between the Rhine and Danube frontiers and Rome can take several weeks. To get messages from the Euphrates to Rome also can take several weeks, and that's going flat out. Rome is not a very convenient capital for an empire which is now under pressure on its frontiers. It's the capital for historical reasons. It's the capital because it was the Roman people who conquered this area. As the capital of a Roman Empire, Rome is in the wrong place. It is just not convenient. Have a look at the position of Constantinople. It's right on the straits that separate Europe from Asia. It's also on the waters that divide the Aegean Sea and therefore the Mediterranean from the Black Sea. Let's talk about commerce, and we must try to rid ourselves of any assumption that the Black Sea is some kind of dead end. You have to go through the Mediterranean into the Aegean and then through the Dardanelles, and then you're in the Black Sea. You do your business in the Black Sea and then you go back through the Dardanelles, back into the Aegean, back into the Mediterranean. No, the Black Sea is itself of immense importance because a number of rivers empty into that sea. You've got the Danube, you've got the Dnieper, you've got the Don. By travelling up these rivers, you can get from the Black Sea deep into Central and into Northern Europe, and you can get yourself pretty well all the way to the Baltic and half the way to the Arctic Circle. Constantinople sits on this connecting strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean world of enormous strategic and commercial significance. It's also close to every important frontier. It's not that far from the Euphrates borders with Persia. It's certainly not far from the Danube. And if it's a long way from the Rhine, well, that actually doesn't matter that much for Constantinople. So it has a first-class commercial position and a first-class strategic position. If you control the waters around Constantinople, you control all movement between Europe and Asia and all movement between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Oh, and talking of commerce, we must also bear in mind the Silk Road that stretches through Central Asia deep into China. This terminates here at the Black Sea. A city built on that strait would be a very useful location. Here, top right, you've got a map showing the usefulness of the site in general terms, but have a look at the more detailed map on the bottom right. You've got a piece of land that is effectively an island. If you enclose this promontory by walls that are sufficiently well fortified, you are then surrounded on three sides by water. And not only that, but you've got this wonderful Golden Horn, an enormous natural harbour. What you can do is you can put a chain across this and stop ships from coming in and going out. You can build a city in a place that is of critical commercial and strategic importance. A place that is naturally well fortified, so long as you can block off the land approaches by sufficiently good land fortifications, and you've got a large natural port where any number of ships can go and shelter in complete security. Why did nobody beforehand ever realize the enormous value of Byzantium, as it was called, as a potential capital of the entire Mediterranean world? Constantine, his family life was not altogether successful or happy. He was perhaps something of a tyrant. But whatever you can say about Constantine, he had the genius to realize that here was a city that could last as the capital of an empire for at least 1,000 years. He needed a new capital because Rome was not suitable as a capital in the changed circumstances of the 4th century. He wanted a new capital. It couldn't be Rome because Rome was so associated with the pagan past. It was many centuries before Rome eventually managed to remake itself as the holy city. Until then it was the imperial city. Although this French painting from the 19th century is not an entirely accurate representation in any respect of what happened, it is a sufficiently accurate representation in the main of what had gone on in Rome. Rome, if you're a Christian, may be the city of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the universal bishop, but at the same time it is also the city of the pagan emperors. Constantine wanted a new city, a Christian city that would not be filled with pagan temples and statues of pagans. It would not be a city where everywhere you looked there were reminders of the bad old days of paganism. He wanted a new capital and a Christian capital. He founded Constantinople in 324. He dedicated it in 330, and this city was protected by relics of the true cross, the rod of Moses, and much else. It was also protected by rather large land walls and sea walls. Its largest building, apart from the imperial palace, was the Church of the Holy Apostles, built on the site of what had been a temple of Aphrodite. And here it is, the New Rome. That was one of the names given to the city. Its official name is of no importance. It very quickly became known universally as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And here is an aerial representation of the city as it may have been around the year, shall we say, 500. As it may have been around the year 550, forgive me, looking at the Hagia Sophia. Certainly by about 350. Constantinople was already the largest and richest city in the Mediterranean world. It may have been the second or third largest city in the world, and it would continue to grow until in the early years of the 6th century it might have a population of 1 million. As I said, it would be the largest and richest city in the Mediterranean world, and it will remain that way for at least the next 800 years. I seem to have finished, or at least I've finished everything I wanted to say. Does anybody have any questions?